Juliana indicated, this first presentation is about climate change and agricultural impacts. Of course, those include the risks of climate change on agriculture and also adaptation, because that really determines the nature of the impacts. I'm on a farm right now. I've worked with cattle and horses for a long time, and I've spent a lot of time on a tractor and a lot of time in a truck, and more importantly, just out on the land. So here are the objectives for this first presentation. So we'll examine the current and the future expected climate changes, especially those relevant for agriculture. I know that you've seen some of the ones earlier from the values in general, but these are relevant to agriculture. So I'm going to hit some areas such as crops and livestock, soil and water. Of course, infrastructure and health are also important, but we'll concentrate on crops and livestock. So then we'll use those to go on to the current and future possible climate impacts. Again, risk and adaptation considered as well. Okay, so I need to click on the screen each time. Okay, I got it. So here are the main messages that I want to reinforce during the talk. So these are the keys that are focused on here. So the first one is that climate resources for agriculture have really changed, and they'll continue to change, perhaps at a more accelerated rate, because that's one of the signatures of climate change. So these agroclimatic resources, that is the climate variables that are linked with agriculture, are things such as growing season length, crop heat units, heat spells, etc. I won't read them all, but there they are for you. So the impacts of those agroclimatic resources are very many. And as I mentioned, I'll emphasize the crops, forage, pasture, soil and water impacts are really important. Now, those are the direct impacts. The indirect impacts are probably even more numerous and are aspects such as diseases, weeds, and insects. We're out looking in the field for all of those. Now, we know from a lot of research that future climate change will bring both positive and negative impacts to agriculture. The multi-billion-dollar question is, what are the net benefits to agriculture? And they really hinge upon the success of those adaptation options to reduce the negative impacts. So here are some terms, just in case just put us on a more common level of understanding. I'm using the climate definition of adaptation. The climate realm has a lot of specific terms, so here are just a few. So meaning adjusting to actual or even the expected climate change and its effects. So risk assessment and risk management is really a large part of that adaptation process linked to those changing agroclimates. And the risk, as you've heard before in the other presentations, is a function not only of the impacts, but of the probabilities of those impacts. So I've mentioned agroclimate variables before, and they are those ones really linked with agriculture. Now, we also talk about the capacity to adapt, and they depend on many capitals, the soils, the natural and financial, human. And we know that farmers have a lot of capacity to adapt, but climate change is pushing some of those for sure. So I want to remind you that adaptation is an entire process, not just a few solutions at the end of the game here. So we're looking at the past agroclimates, growing season, and heat units, for instance, that really set the baseline for what we understand. We assess those past agricultural impacts of those climates. We explore and estimate future possible agroclimates. Then we look at the future possible impacts and vulnerabilities. And as part of those vulnerabilities, we're looking at the exposure, of which agriculture has a lot of, sensitivity, ditto, and adaptive capacity there that determine those vulnerabilities. And then we manage the risk. We continue to monitor, evaluate, learn, and improve, as you've heard from for instance, some of the other speakers. This is a continuation. So in other words, we really need to determine the nature of the problem in order to determine successful solutions. So here's a really nice adaptation competency framework that Robin Cox at Royal Roads has developed. You can see that there are 5 main parts, and each of those parts are intimately connected and have many subparts. So I'll just look at a few. Of course, being a climate scientist, I'm very much interested in the climate change science and adaptation and those knowledge systems. Of course, we have leadership working together, communication. Understanding the climate adaptation challenge is another one of the keys. And that's because the impacts depend very much on the adaptation capability. And then there's planning and implementation. And we're gaining a lot of capability in that area. Have a lot to go, but have a lot. So in terms of vulnerability and some basic questions, we ask, why bother finding out about the agricultural risks of climate change? Aren't we doing enough already? Well, the reasons are, of course, is that agriculture is very exposed and very sensitive to climate. It's out there. It's so exposed. Let me give you an example. Droughts and result in considerable agricultural losses, and we'll be certainly looking at this year's droughts extending across a large part of North America. So an example is the drought of the early 2000s. We have done extensive work on assessing the impacts, well, of course, the agroclimates, the impacts, the vulnerabilities, and an economic colleague of mine also determined the effects, the economic effects. And the Canadian GDP dropped almost $6 billion in those early drought years. And agricultural losses specifically were well over $1 billion. And this is an example for Alberta I'm giving. So Saskatchewan is also affected. Now, excess moisture and flooding also result in crop losses and a lot of other damage, but they aren't quite as extensive or as persistent as those drought losses. And we can also use them to store some water. I'm not undermining that effect of flooding. It can be quite bad. So here's some more reasons, as we have a lot of them, so I'll just give a few more. So human and livestock health are really affected by heat stress. And of course, we've had a very good example of it recently. Mosquitoes that carry West Nile virus do very well in hot spells. And people and animals don't do very well in hot spells. So reliable water supplies really depend upon the climate and also other aspects such as transportation. It's critical to look at the combination of these effects, as they can combine to really affect not only the economy, but society, environment, and health. Lots of possibilities for harm. So I have several parts here, about 5 parts. This first part is a closer look at the climate risks to agriculture, addressing that question. I want to just remind you, in case you haven't memorized the types of past changes, looking at the prairie region here, is that winter is fading in simple words. The winter temperature departures from the prairies in this lower right graph really give you that indication. In the the late 1940s, the mean annual temperature was about close to -2. And now, closer to 2017, the mean annual temperature is +2. So an amazing change. And the means really give us a clear idea of a lot of much bigger changes going on. So let's look at some of the extremes, both hot and cold. First of all, looking at the vertical axis is in days, the horizontal axis is in years. And the number of days with -35 and greater, and lower, sorry, were well over 15 degrees in those mid to late 60s. And we also had a lot in the 70s and 80s, as you can see here. The running mean is in the red line. And those extremes still occur, of course. We are in a continental climate, but they're really, really vanishing. So the biggest change in this last several decades has been in terms of those extreme cold days. So let's turn now to an example of the number of hot days, taking Saskatoon as an example because I'm familiar with it and have the data. So again, starting in the 1960s, we see that some of the drought years, such as the 80s, have had a lot of heat, just like this past year. The early 2000s, a lot of heat with a high number, more than 4. And we've had a few lately, but 2021 really blew this out of the water. That will start the trend to even greater hot days. So we'll be watching for that. And that's simply amazing. So I wanted to give you a geographical look at the warm days per year in this left graph with maximum temperatures greater than 25. So they've increased not only in terms of specific stations, but for large areas, especially northern Alberta. By the way, this is Alberta. So you see values greater than 2 days, sorry. This is warm days per year have increased. Now the cold days per year have shown a much more dramatic change with a decrease of more than 2 days per year over this time period. By the way, I have these references in the slide notes. So, and I have a lot of references. So in case you need those will be there. So an very important aspect for agriculture, and indeed for all vegetation and many other aspects, is the frost-free season. And that has really changed. As I say here, about a month since the 1960s, and it's probably changing even more rapidly. So again, here's the trend line with years on the bottom and the vertical axis days again. So we see that in the mid 60s, the number of days was 105 or so on average for this location in Central Prairies. And as you go into more recent times, this has really increased, pushing, the 140 aspect. So considerable changes here. You'll know a lot of variability with extensive dips, but notice these dips have occurred fairly long ago and aren't as significant now recently, although they certainly do occur. So that's frost-free season. Now, minimum temperature, taking this example is days with minimum temperatures 15 degrees or higher. Now, you might ask, well, why are these important? These give us a really good capability to restore ourselves from the heat of the day. If we have lower minimum temperatures, that really helps. And especially for crops like canola, for instance. So the message here is that the trend line to days with minimum temperatures, 15 degrees or greater, has really increased. We no longer have those advantages of the distinct cooling at night. So that's another aspect to look for, another aspect that's not only important for human health, but very important for vegetation health, for dealing with hot temperatures. This is the geographical pattern of length of frost-free season. This is given in terms of trends in days. How do I go back here? Anyways, in days per decade. So there was considerable change even on a geographical basis. Now let's turn to degree days over 5 degrees. Now these are commonly used in agriculture to determine the types of crops and productivity of crops. It's just a really good indicator of the heat degrees. I'll focus on the map that shows the pattern of degrees C per decade trend. There's another one for 15 degrees, which is for trees and other plants. But I'll look at the 5 degrees. So you can see a lot of increase over 25 degrees C per decade for a large portion of Alberta, especially the west and the north, with some areas that are different. But so that's the geographical pattern. So we expect not only a pattern through time changing and accelerating, but also a pattern through space as well, through areas. So let's turn to precipitation patterns through time and space, a geographical look. And now I have an example from Lethbridge from 1938 to 2006 in terms of the precipitation difference from average. So here's the average line is 0. These are the differences from average in percentage. And I want you to note the oscillations, with the 80s being, the 40s have some periods that are quite wet, 1951, and some times that are quite dry, with increasing dryness more recently, especially in the early 2000s, and of course, last year. So a lot of variability, some oscillations, and each station will be somewhat different, each location. So again, precipitation patterns over time. Now we're looking at the entire prairie region and the 1951 to 80 departures from average again. Departures from average gives us a clear indication of those extremes. So here we see in the 50s a wetter time, and some of the years of the late 70s, both dry and wet. You see, let me point out the switches here. And we've had that in 2003, even during a drought, an amazing switch from quite wet to fairly dry. And then those early 2000s that are quite dry, exceeding a minus 30% drop in precipitation from average. So that's the precipitation patterns over time for the prairie region. Now we really need to look at the water balance, not only the precipitation, not only the temperature, but the combination of precipitation and the atmospheric demand for that water, or how the water is lost through evapotranspiration. And the index we're using here is the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. Now that there are a lot of other indices for water balance, but the important thing is to use that balance of precipitation and evaporation. So this time series is for the Old Man River watershed. Some of the work that we did in one of Dave Sotchin's projects, and Dave will be talking later on here. So we plot this index. Positive values are wetter, negative values are drier. And we can see for the pattern of the Oldman River watershed that, again, you see those oscillations, and you see the extreme wet, 1927, 1951, and so in 1993, and you see the dry portions. So the water balance gives you a really good indication of the patterns of both wet and dry. Now we've looked at patterns over time. Let's look at drought patterns over space. This is another water balance indicator, the Palmer Drought Severity Index for summer. And I'm using the -3 isoline, which is a really intense drought. So looking at the map of North America, these isolines indicate the very core of these droughts. So in 1931, for instance, demarcated by the red line, you see a lot of core areas in very many places. 1961 was a massive drought for North America, and especially for the southern prairies, and also 1988. But look at these 2001, 2002 droughts. Remembering this is just the core. The drought expanded well beyond this. So we can see that some of these droughts have migrated from the US. So let's watch the US in future droughts, in the past drought as well. We see some drought, these more recent droughts, expanding into areas that have usually have a greater, that are wetter, have a greater precipitation effectiveness. We really need to watch those winter and snow drought signals. Very important for agricultural drought. Note that the causes, we're examining the causes of drought in our research. They're complex, the combination of many things, and we also see some changes. And again, here are some of your references for this work. So we've recently done a lot more work looking at the patterns of the very major severe droughts in the prairie agricultural region for over a very long time period, as you can see here. So, by the way, we've also looked at the life cycle of drought, when they start, their growth, their persistence, and their termination. Okay, so this is for the prairie agricultural region. We've had we've picked out 10 major droughts here, very major. And note that many of those major droughts occurred before about the early 60s. We've had a couple since then, and of course we expect a lot more, but this is the pattern that we've seen with the 1920 drought, really severe in terms of not only intensity, but also area. We've combined both of those parameters in this work that we've done here, that I included the reference. So let's turn to groundwater now. I really need my well here, south of Saskatoon, and they're very important for many rural areas and most farms. So we need to follow carefully the link of the groundwater levels and a water balance. That is a factor of climate, of course. So this is an example of the connection of an observation well at this specific location and how it relates to the water balance in blue. The groundwater level changes. Observation, it's an observation well, so it's not being used except for research purposes. So that's the trend here. And note that there is a very good correspondence of the peaks and the valleys. So So the message is that in drought years, that groundwater levels are really affected and need help from our wetland recharge and many other aspects of recharge. Snow cover. You may like it or you may not, depending on your perspective. But putting an agricultural perspective on this is that it has many more benefits than problems for agriculture. Note here that the snow cover at the end of March, as a signature of change, is near zeros now. It used to be a lot higher. We're losing our glaciers, and that's a much needed input to river flow, especially in those in summer and especially in the dry times. So winter benefits are being lost, and we need to bear this in mind as we go into the future in terms of adaptation to these changes. So I wouldn't be a very good climate scientist if I didn't draw your attention to other extremes. Those storms, wind, and heat can also be very damaging. This smaller amount of hail may not look too dangerous, but believe me, if you're a sensitive plant or even sensitive animal, you'd have trouble. I'm just listing some of the other extremes here. And they include wind erosion, plow wind. Southern Alberta has had many of those, including hail, of course. Now, the multi-day precipitation events are something that we're looking more closely at because they appear to be increasing and will cause even further problems with increasing intensity of rainfall. Of course, the extended heat waves, we know all about that with our just this past summer, and again, those hailstorms. So many other extremes to look for. Now we've come to the part where I'll just give you a quick summary of the changing climate resources for agriculture. The frost-free season is something to really note. It's lengthened about a month in some areas, especially the central and especially Alberta. Crop heat units have increased, and that gives us a lot of capabilities. The number of hot days has increased slightly. Now, this latest summer will change that a bit. Number of cold days are vanishing, and winter advantage are decreasing. Now, in terms of causes of these amazing extremes, we really have to look at the jet stream and storm tracks and those big waves in the westerlies. Those are becoming loopier and lazier. And anytime there are big loops in the jet stream and the westerly waves, that is indeed a problem, because that means that these storms or the drought and heat will just stay around a lot longer and be a lot more intense. So please watch those jet streams and storm tracks. They're really important for these extremes, and find out more about them. So we're now turning to step 2, the agricultural effects of those changing climate. These clouds really are dangerous, by the way. So if you see those, watch out. So the first thing I want to talk about is some of McKinney's work, Dan McKinney and his colleagues, about plant hardiness changes. Those zones have really changed dramatically in Canada. And that gives us a very strong idea that the climate zones we not only expect them to shift in the future, they've already shifted considerably. And plants are growing in more different zones than people realize. This is why we're able to grow more pulses and corn and sunflowers. These are the new crops and varieties that are increasingly possible. The caveat, of course, is those extreme events not only the hot spells, but also the cold spells, and they affect those capabilities. So this is a map of the prairies that tells you, especially for Alberta, you've had significant changes in zone 2 in the north, zone 3 and zone 4. The climate zones from the south are really shifting into these southern locations and have a lot of changes. Saskatchewan, for example, now is more zone 3. Manitoba, more zone 3, and many communities are experiencing these changes. So I must remind you that these changing climate zones really have a lot of meaning for agriculture. It means increased productivity for plants, increasing diversity of plants, and changing to animals, perhaps animals as well. So if you don't believe the thermometers, the spring blossom dates are changing very rapidly, and about a month earlier, or probably more in some places. Note that plants and animals' ranges and other characteristics are changing. Insects are really, really capable, and they will be the early indicators. These have many implications for agriculture, and will give us some surprises that we aren't aware of. Turning more to insects, we know that grasshoppers really like the drought and hot weather. And we've seen really strong examples of that this last year. Also, not only grasshoppers, but gophers really like this hot weather. Okay, so we have insects like the Culex tarsalis mosquito that can carry viruses and do a lot of damage. We have the mountain pine beetles, of course, and many other insects such as ticks that are moving into new areas and giving us new problems. And I leave you with the questions about other insects and diseases. So this graph really gives the reminder and the message that wheat yields, as an indicator for other crops in the Oldman River watershed, as an example, really depend on climate, using the water balance here, for example. So the crop yields are given in the red squares. The water balance, again for the Oldman River example, are given in the bars. And as for groundwater, and in fact this is a much greater correlation than groundwater, you can see a very strong and very significant correlation between water balance and wheat yields. And when you drill down to more specific, smaller areas, the correlation is even greater. So watch out for that. So the soil resource is exceedingly important. And adaptation in terms of conservation of soil and water is exceedingly important to avoid such circumstances as this field that was excessively damaged by soil erosion. In fact, nothing grows there. And so that sort of aspect really has to be avoided. And we have a lot of tools to do that. So this part 3 now gets us into the future expected climates. Those really help us to be aware and informed of the risks. The previous steps allow us to know the connections, the exposure, the sensitivity of agriculture, a bit about what sort of adaptive solutions might be best. So these are some of the main risks. There are many other risks. A main one is the soil moisture and water supplies. Those are the main limitations. If you don't have enough soil moisture, carbon dioxide, fertilization, Other aspects, varieties won't help at all. Well, not enough anyways. So the increasing heat definitely has strong risks, really brought home this last summer. Increasing growing season length has benefits if we can make use of that. And again, that depends on, for instance, the crop varieties that we have. And all of these can be beneficial depending on the success of the risk management. I just want to remind you, you've perhaps seen some of this before, but not memorized the numbers. I want to remind you that and this is for the Canadian prairies specifically, the maps are for Canada, but the numbers are for the Canadian prairies. We project annual temperature to increase in quite a strong range, depending on whether you're looking at the low carbon or the high carbon future for temperature and this is for winter. Now we're on the higher carbon path, so we need to be more aware of that as well. So towards the 50s, into the near future, we see an increase of another 2 degrees at least, and much more past 6 into the farther future. So those are the types of general temperature futures that we expect to see. So turning now to precipitation change, again, winter, summer, map of Canada, but this is data for the prairies. We see an annual precipitation increase expected in the range of 5 to 6% into the near future and more into the far future, again, depending on what concentration of carbon we're looking at. So those are a reminder of what sort of future temperature and precipitation. Of course, those data extend into what sort of water balance we expect. I've mentioned about the importance of snow cover. I look for trying to trap as much snow cover on my land as possible. Now into the 2050s, the sort of near to mid future, look at the southern prairies, and you can see this isoline of the sort of medium tan color. That's a decrease of -40 to about half of the snow cover that we have now. And as you know, the March amount of snow cover is near zero, as I've told you before already. So this amount won't be as much protection for plants and water supply, unfortunately. So our plans really have to take that into consideration. Of course, remember the variability. We can have a lot of high variability, and with accelerated hydrological cycle, don't put your snow blowers away yet. So we're looking again at growing seasons, but this is into the future, of course. A reminder that growing season has already increased, and you can see with this map, especially in southern Alberta, look at these numbers. 30 days, a bit in Saskatchewan, not as much in Manitoba. So there's quite a geographical difference. Let's look at projected changes in growing season length. We'll look at the 8.5 because that's the high carbon emissions, because we're on that pathway already, unfortunately. So we see quite a range of another at least 40 days increase into that farther future. So quite a change. This means change your crop varieties, but expect a lot of problems. And one of the problems, speaking of problems, is something that I've worked on for a long time with many colleagues, past droughts, and this is what we've found in results for quite a while about future expected drought, and of course the massive risks the chances of multi-year droughts really increases, and those are harder to deal with. And they increase in many characteristics. So they overwhelm those slight increases in precipitation that we're expecting. I'll remind you, as you already know, that there are a lot of drought risks to many aspects of our communities. And I've drawn your attention to those fast switches from drought to extreme rainfalls. And we'll have more of those in the future, especially with those changing jet stream patterns that I've alerted you to really watch for as they slow down and cause more problems. So turning now again to climate extremes. Note that the highest temperature records in Canada used to be yellow grass and Mydale in southwestern Saskatchewan. Now those were blown out of were incinerated by Lissen's record of near 50 degrees. As a climate scientist, you don't expect such an increase. By the way, the people in Canada have been looking at the attribution, and that exceedance would not have occurred without climate change, human-caused climate change. So the question is, what will happen to our rainfall extremes? It's only a matter of short time before these current extremes at Buffalo Gap and Vanguard are going to be exceeded. And look at how amazing these are. 250 millimeters in 1 hour, more than the whole annual precipitation in 8 hours for Vanguard. Just a good thing that didn't happen at a city. Would have been quite the problem. So I want to summarize now what we expect in future climates. So this is just a summary of many of the details. So accelerated changes in all those items that I mentioned. And you have the list here. You have a very strong indication that past droughts could seem even mild compared with our future droughts. Increased potential for major storms and floods, again, is linked to changes in the jet stream pattern and the westerly waves. More the switches of wet and dry, again, you can blame the jet stream. And a destabilization of the climate occurring. And it'll be really amazing to see what sort of extremes we'll see. A couple more steps here for you. So this one considers the future expected impacts on crops, rain, pasture, and those aspects. So here are the agricultural impacts expected. Remember that the plant hardiness index and climate shifts. Well, those indicate an increase of crop yields and biomass with increasing growing season and heat units. So that's those plant hardiness zone changes. So warm weather vegetation is already doing better, the pulses, but not only the crops, but also the weeds and new types of weeds and so on. We have many wild cards in this picture, and those are the increasing drought and probably those insects and diseases, weeds as well, all have to watch out for. We're finding in our work that we're seeing higher variability, and that indeed is a considerable challenge. Water resources. Water, soil moisture is our main limitation for agriculture in the prairies, and especially the southern prairies. So we're watching that snow cover season length and also area. We're expecting even greater intensity of precipitation. The glaciers have really are disappearing. We need those. Evaporation demand is certainly something to look at. and it's definitely increasing. That's one of the main certainties we have here. We actually have to watch for water quality. We've lost some cattle herds in the past while with heat and water quality degradation. Lastly here, we have much more demand on all those water supplies with heat. Now, grasslands are really important for agricultural production in the prairies. And I'm taking an example of June 2002, where grass growth on the prairies was rated poor on a wide sweep of the prairies, almost all of agricultural Alberta, a very tough situation. And that was even more extensive this past summer. This same pasture that I show here showed nothing this past year. Had to start feeding the livestock about a month early, at least. So, giving you a change from the maps and the graphs, here is a conceptual diagram of how climate change can affect agricultural resources and also management. Again, the reference is here. And I'm using agro-environmental indices that OECD and Agriculture Canada use for evaluating agro-environmental qualities. So when we have increasing drought and excessive moisture that we forecast to continue and accelerate, these four main aspects really are affected: soil quality, water supply and demand, and farmland management. So looking at farmland management more specifically, I've given you examples of each of these, but and those are land use and several other aspects. So my slides want to jump to model changes in future crop yields. So we really depend on modeling to give us an indication of future yield changes on crops. So we expect, this is a combination of work that I've taken from Agriculture Canada researchers. So we do expect some yield increases. Quite a bit of that yield is related to carbon dioxide fertilization with quite a range. So maybe don't depend upon that. We see spring wheat yield increases of at least about 10% for several locations across the prairies. And especially, I should tell you that the modelers, crop modelers, also use some adaptation, such as early seeding, and also consider some better varieties in some cases, not all. Unfortunately for canola, likely because of those hot spells being so hard on the reproductive period of the flowering, we only have one example here, but do expect some yield decreases. Now, grass has quite a potential because it grows over the whole growing season and can go into, they can really deal with drought quite well. So we expect grass growth to increase. Again, depending on the extent of those droughts, can be really, really nasty effects. So I want to give you the question about implications for markets and food security. As you do know, Canada is a major exporter of grains, oilseeds, and pulses. So an important source of food for other countries. And speaking of other countries, warmer countries, tropical countries, are expected to have more adverse effects on food production than the cooler countries, such as Russia and Canada. Of course, we have a lot of knowledge gaps, but we are in a really affected by that trade So the last step here is adaptation planning. How do we link farm management and other adaptation planning through levels of government and communities to those changes in agroclimate? And to do that, I want to give you the context for Albertan farms. I won't read all of these, but just want you to remind you of what we're looking at in terms of many farms and farms families, many farms, a lot of livestock, a lot of farm capital, and this is all obtained from the Census of Agriculture fairly recently. So these are the aspects at risk and possible benefit with changing climate. So we really have to target and identify risk solutions to the changing climate. If we don't target them and take into consideration what aspects of climate are changing and what impacts they're expecting, we're not doing a sufficient job. So number one, increase awareness of these changes is really required. Don't expect to have the same growing season lengths. Don't expect to have the same sort of heat units. So that matching is really needed. Another aspect is there are a lot of myths about climate change. Whenever I give a presentation, of course, I like to hear questions beforehand and target the presentations to those. And then some of the questions afterwards indicate a reliance on some poor information. So we need to deal with those. Just a reminder that risk management occurs at right up from the individual livestock and as definitely the producers and the communities and all levels of government. We're all involved here and all have a responsibility. I see that the Alberta government has some really interesting and useful risk management paths to plan and prepare. For instance, the drought and excessive moisture plan is excellent. And we need to take advantage of those. We need to take advantage of Alberta's agroclimatic information services and all those amazing climate stations that they have. And so on. Here are some farm level adaptation examples. Seeding and harvesting dates are critical. And I've said that the crop modelers actually use changes in those to see what changes in those adaptations have effect on reducing the negative impacts on yield. Soil and water conservation is exceedingly important. Minimum till in the prairies has really shown up to advantages in many aspects, including those agro-environmental indices that I showed you in terms of soil quality, for instance, and so on. Many examples. Finance and insurance. Insurance is really important. We need to cover those really bad years. Crop varieties have a lot of capabilities and do very well. That reminds me that we also need diversity of crop types because the lentils have done moderately well in drought years, but we also need crops that do well in more normal years, for instance. Then turning to technology, there's a lot of technology that can be applied to find those weed problems or provide many other types of capabilities. And these are just a few examples, many more right at the farm level. And speaking of more, so we can do a lot with rotational intensive grazing, pest management of various sources, including making sure that we find out what pests are out there. and enhanced use of early warning systems. Agriculture Canada has the Canadian Drought Monitor, very important, and they're making more amazing changes to that to enable climate smart agriculture. So I just want to remind you that the knowledge gap is how well these adaptation work with the knowledge, with the benefits of a changing climate. And that leads me to the topic of gaining opportunities for agriculture, which are quite possible. And we've already seen a lot of them over the past years. That first step is awareness. We've seen a lot of changes, and we're going to see more. Then how do we use that climate information? That's important too. We need to really make much more and much better use of it. And we're, as producers, as farmers, we're aware of those effects, but they're going to accelerate. And indeed, we have to look at even sea level rise in terms of ports, effects of flooding on transportation and infrastructure, for example, and even heat. So we need many more innovations. We already have a lot at the producer level. We need to ask, what are the implications for sustainability? We can use those agro-environmental indices to look at changing soil quality, for instance, and so on. Then, of course, we're a market-driven economy, and competing countries are affected a lot by climate change. Russia, for instance, put an embargo on exports in a previous drought year, and more of that could happen. The US has had a terrible time with the past drought this summer, and the crop yields forecast is quite low. So those are the opportunities that can be gained for agriculture with these steps that I've put forward. So in conclusion, I'm just wrapping up now. And again, here are these main messages that I want to just reinforce for you. So those risks for agriculture and possible benefits, if you adapt properly, have changed and will accelerate. Here are some of the many agroclimatic resources, both positive and negative, depending on how well adaptation works. So the impacts are not only on crops, forage, but also people and communities, infrastructure. But we're looking especially at these main ones, the soil and so on. So watch out also for the indirect impacts of climate. Not only weeds and insects, but also gophers and other aspects. They really like some of the changes. Will the net benefits of those positive and negative impacts are important to consider. All of this really depends on the success of adaptation options. Innovation using many aspects. There are a warning here. We have barriers to adaptation, many, and without sufficient water, that limitation is really, really a big barrier. Now, I will leave you with this main question. My other slides are reliable sources of information. Please use really reliable sources of information. So I'll leave you with this main question. Now, what do these changes mean for agriculture, agribusiness, food security, and communities? Our research really needs to expand beyond this and to the farm level for these main questions. So I'll leave you with those questions and expect some of your own. Thanks for your interest.
Based on what Elaine has presented today, we'd like to know what the risk is that's most notable in your work. What are you most concerned about? We'd like to know how well you think folks in the industry understand climate change risks. So, you know, the things that Elaine's presented, do you think that would be new to most folks? Do you think most folks are pretty familiar or not concerned?
So adaptation in the climate change equation for agriculture. That's what we're getting into. And thank you, Elaine, for building up to this part. I'm just going to have a little quick peek to provide everyone information about what's currently going on in federally and provincially related to agriculture. And then I'm going to give an example from BC, which, as Juliana said, that's where I am. I guess maybe tragedy forces innovation, and BC definitely has its extreme weather events, like across the province. But we have an example that I'm hoping people can see a benefit from. So, well, if we go international, we have ISO standards related to quantifying carbon offsetting. ISO is, it develops and publishes technical standards. Mostly the ISO stuff is about what does agriculture contribute to climate change, the greenhouse gas story. It talks a little bit about risk associated with that and about carbon offsetting. Then we get into Farmers for Climate Solutions. That's a national program in Canada. That's an alliance of farmer organizations and supporters. And the main push on that one, Farmers for Climate Solutions, is farmers are going to be a part of the solution to climate change. Agriculture will be part of the solution to climate change. So the mitigation equation. They also work to advance agricultural policies to help Canadian farmers mitigate and adapt to climate change. And I think they're doing a lot, because I do get emails every other week about what Farmers for Climate Solutions are doing, and putting up job postings, looking for more people to work on their teams. Then we have the Beef Research Drought Blog. That's also a federal one, and it's a resource for cattle producers. A blog, by definition, it's a live site, tons of tools on there, opportunity for producers to ask questions specific to drought and cattle production, and they can make it regionally specific and connect with experts in their area. And then we've got the Alberta Government Climate Smart Agricultural Resources. That one's a bit more about definitions around climate change. And again, it does present the story of what agriculture contributes to climate change, the greenhouse gas equation. And it does expand to look at opportunities for improving agricultural practices, so mitigations, and then links to resources. And then every province has some sort of research and development, whether it's through university or government, related to crop development. And in Alberta, Olds has an Alberta Field Crop Development Center. That's all about working towards new varieties to build resilience and then pass that information on to producers. And then in Alberta, also as part of the adaptive resilience training, this is Project Assistance. It's a program that's a partnership between Alberta Environment and Parks and Brace, and the University Alberta Sustainability Program facilitates it, it administrates it. So the project assistants go out and work in communities to help work towards climate change adaptation awareness. Here's some examples of some projects that some PAs have done specific to agriculture. And then this link is through YouTube, and presentations from the PAs are 3 to 4 minutes long. And it's a great example of where there's been research and data analysis and review of technology and developing tools, technology tools to help support adaptation and resilience in the agricultural sector. In BC, so there's the BC Climate and Agricultural Initiative. It was established in 2008 by the BC Ministry of Agriculture in partnership with a number of people, a number of organizations. If you go to the BC Ministry of Agriculture website and type in anything related to climate and agriculture, it actually just hot links you to this BC Climate and Agriculture Initiative. The intention is to facilitate collaboration, deliver programs, develop tools and resources, and share information. Okay. This is an example of, or this demonstrates the partnerships within this organization, which is key to its success. There's the strategic and administrative and operational partners. There you're looking at bigger industry, BC Agriculture Research and Development, Investment Agriculture Foundation, federal government and provincial government, which are the primary funders. And then you get into the advisory committees, which are also industry and government. Then on the project implementation side and delivery, that's when the producer associations, individual producers and farm operators and technical specialists come in. You have NGOs, universities, private funding, and then the local government, along with the provincial and federal government, work together to form committees and working groups. So it's at the implementation and delivery stage. The guiding principles, big star. Increase knowledge and awareness. Once you increase knowledge and awareness, you can increase adaptive capacity. If you can share information that people can apply, then you're going to increase the ability for farmers to be more resilient and our agricultural industry to be more resilient. The application has to be a combination of data and research with practical knowledge, making it tools and resources that actually will benefit producers. And the involvement of local government and local industry is essential. That's where a lot of funding or financial contribution comes in. And the level of involvement of local government and industry is generally an indicator of success if there's strong involvement. And then testing and demonstrating the tools and resources that are built. Do they work? Do they have to change? There's the regional level that the BC CAI works on, and then there's the farmer level. So at the regional level, BC, breaking up BC into regions, for example, the Peace region or the Okanagan region or Thompson-Nicola, they go specific to a region and build partnerships. So that's where they set up regional committees, confirm who the representatives are from what agricultural groups and local and provincial governments to sit on those committees. Then review background research, what information is available, interview local producers and local government representatives to find out what's been going on there, what are the issues, what has worked, what hasn't. And then once there's an understanding of that story, the commitment of folks involved, then workshops happen. And that's where climate projections are discussed, priorities are identified related to climate issues, and then strategies and actions developed. And then the draft adaptation plan, which is again presented at workshops and reviewed to make sure does it make sense. And from that adaptation program, they can launch into implementing projects. And then we get to the farmer level, and that's where funding comes in. The BC CAI helps to review applications and apply the funding, and that's for farm level applied research projects that are all designed to help producers adapt. An example is the BC Forage Council with the Peace River Association, plus the local producers, the Caribou and Peace Region producers, looking at technologies to improve soil health, which will boost yields and improve resilience to drought conditions and extreme rainfall. Here's some other examples, and this is specific to the Peace Region, of some farm adaptation and innovator programs. They're fact sheets, webinars, and best practices, all that can be linked within the BCCAI, and all are linked specific to the Peace region. And then there's also another set of documents for all the other regions, but it's a great resource for producers to go to, and government and industry to go to see what's being done and what can be done to be more resilient and adapt to climate change. Okay, so there's lots going on related to agriculture and climate change. And there's going to continue to be more with everything going on in the world. So just keep watching, and there's not a need to reinvent the wheel. We can take advantage of what's there.
Okay. Well, given that comments from Melanie and the outstanding and comprehensive presentation by Elaine, I'll just add a few more observations about adaptation in the agriculture sector and refer to research at Park in Alberta and Saskatchewan. You can see there's an image here of some cropland. This is just west of Regina. And actually it represents adaptation, because if I had taken this picture 30, 40 years ago, this would probably be a fallow field, but now it's the stubble and the residue has been maintained. This was an adaptation initially to soil degradation, but it also represents a good adaptation to climate change and variability. Just to put the prairies in perspective, here's the world's cropland, the brown area, and the darker the tone, the more productive is the cropland. The thing to note is as you'd expect, the most productive cropland in the world is at the lower latitudes and near the oceans. These are the warmer climates, and near the ocean, the climate is more consistent and moderate. If you go to the higher latitudes, and if you look at the Canadian prairies, agriculture extends in the Peace River country north of 55 degrees north. If you go over to Europe, yeah, there are places where agriculture occurs at that latitude, but they're near water. They're near the ocean, which is warm. And if you go inland, there is some agriculture at higher latitudes, but it's not nearly as productive. It's in places like Kazakhstan and Siberia, it is less productive. So you can argue that in Western Canada, we've developed the most commercially viable agricultural industry in one of the least favorable climates on Earth. It's a continental climate. It's a high latitude climate with a relatively short growing season. And so at the higher latitudes, there's less heat, but also in the continental interiors, there's a much more variable climate. And Elaine referred to this several times, the extreme variability from year to year. Here's another map of the world showing the year-to-year variation in the climate moisture index, which is the difference between precipitation and evapotranspiration. Anything in brown, has a coefficient of variation of less than 25%. So most of the world, the hydroclimate is not that variable. I won't explain why there are different colors, but anything that's in color has a variable hydroclimate. And these variable hydroclimates occur in the transition between forest and grassland. Mostly these are fairly sharp transitions. But if you look in the center of Eurasia, this large continent, in Western China, in Mongolia, Siberia, Kazakhstan, there's a large area of variable climate. And the other large region is in the center of North America, and in particular, the Canadian prairies is one of these large regions of a variable hydroclimate. So we have to deal both with the short growing season in a global context and also an extremely variable hydroclimate. And yet agriculture has succeeded through adaptation, starting right off with the introduction of crop production on the prairies and the disking of the prairie sod. This is the Beebe brothers disking the prairie sod near Spondon, Alberta in May 1914. And here is one of the Beebe brothers, Guy Beebe, stooking, and he's not near Spondon. If you look in the background, there's a shelter belt. This is in the county of Flagstaff near Lougheed, Alberta, because my grandfather, Guy Beebe, moved his family, including my mom, from southern Alberta to central Alberta in the 1930s, as did a very large segment of the population of southern Alberta. So the depopulation of southeastern Alberta was an adaptation to a climate event. In fact, migration and depopulation represent an extreme adaptation. In fact, we're probably going to see much of this later in this century, where parts of the world become depopulated because they're no longer habitable, and they're going to look for places like Western Canada to immigrate. So that's an extreme case of adaptation. But if you look at southern Alberta from the air, from Google Earth, you see imprinted in the landscape, you see the expression of adaptation. So all the strip cropping, the irrigation crop circles, the canals, the reservoirs, the land that's not suitable for crop production is left to pasture. These all represent adaptations to climate variability. And so it's expressed in the landscape of southern Alberta. And I should mention that a lot of this innovation, a lot of this adaptation was, in fact, nearly all of it was post 1930s and was enabled by the introduction and the creation of the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration. PFRA is often cited as the best example in the whole world of an institutional response to a climate event. And it lasted for 70 years. This headline, I didn't write this. This is a headline from an article in Canadian Cowboy magazine. It's probably a bit of an overstatement, the death of PFRA, but in fact, PFRA was eliminated in 2012, 2013, which really left a gap in the institutional adaptation framework on Western Canada. Because PFRA had not only rehabilitated prairie farming, had built all these reservoirs and dugouts and shelter belts and et cetera, PFRA had developed into an organization that was implementing an adaptive response to climate change through various programs like the Drought Preparedness Program. And with the demise of PFRA, other agencies have had to step in, the provincial ag agencies, the watershed stewardship groups and so on have stepped in, but still there is this gap left where there isn't a single organization on the prairies that has provided this bridge between the science of climate change and adaptation. Well, I mention this in particular because the organization that I direct, PARC, was established more than 20 years ago to do research on climate change and adaptation in the prairie provinces. And the reason given for putting it in Regina was because Regina was the national headquarters of PFRA. And PARC worked very closely with PFRA until it was eliminated finally in 2013. I should also mention that in more recent years, PARC is one of the 3 founding partners of Climate West. You've heard about Climate West already because it will be the repository for these art project presentations. Well, Juliana mentioned that I've given hundreds of presentations on climate change, which is probably the most enjoyable part of my job. And what I missed most during the pandemic is the opportunity to talk to crop producers and cattle ranchers. So of the, I don't know, hundreds of presentations I've given, a lot of them have been in hockey arenas, curling rinks, community halls, to groups like this, where I learn about adaptation in the ag sector. And I go to the trade shows and I look at the booths and I talk to farmers. And that's the huge disadvantage of this kind of forum, where the virtual presentations, we sign off and say goodbye and we don't have the chance to chat. Well, this was a presentation that I gave in Sedgwick, which is in the county of Flagstaff. And this is crop yield data for barley for the county of Flagstaff back to 2000 and as recently as 2019. And the thing to note is going up. Yields are increasing in all crops. Now you can attribute a lot of this to improved farming practices, but this increase in yields is highly correlated with the agroclimatic variables that Elaine mentioned, with an increase in the length of the growing season, with the increase in the growing degree days. So we can argue that we can already see the impact of climate change in terms of increasing yield. This is barley yields. This is yield of forage on rangeland in southeastern Alberta. It's also going up. And it's even more directly related to climate because, of course, there isn't the same degree of management of the rangeland as there is of cropland. But the thing to note is, even though there's an upward trend since the 1980s, there are years in which yield is very low because the ultimate limitation on pasture and crop productivity, as you already heard, is, of course, soil moisture. So this will always be the major constraint. Even given the benefits of a warming climate, this will always be the major constraint on crop production and pasture yield on the prairies. Including this year, this is a map from the drought monitor maintained by Agriculture by AFC, formerly maintained by PFRA. And the area in red is the area that until August the 10th had received 40% of normal precipitation. Now the situation has changed throughout a large part of this area, in particular southern Saskatchewan and southwestern Manitoba. In the last month, there's actually been above normal precipitation. But already by August 10th, the damage had been done, that crop yield, the dryland crop production already had been devastated by this drought. I've read and I've heard that the rains that have come since then have improved pasture conditions. So some cattle producers have been able to maintain their herds. But of course, like I said, the damage was already done in terms of crop production. Given the significance of soil moisture, then one of the programs in Alberta that's especially important and that Elaine referred to is Alberta's Ag Drought and Excess Moisture Management Plan. An important resource and a great plan and a great document. And so this plan includes a response toolbox, the options and resources available during times of drought, being aware of government response, using timely, relevant information, risk management, water pumping programs, tax referrals, and so on. I'll let you read this. But what I want to point out is most of this is just a reaction to the drought that has already occurred. So in addition to taking advantage of these various programs and sources of information, of course, there's a need for more planned and proactive adaptation to climate change. Here's a high-level look at planned adaptation to climate change in terms of the key principles. Effective adaptation to climate change must be sustainable. It must take advantage of the capacity of natural systems to boost resilience and to buffer climate risks. There has to be partnerships. The local and community has to be engaged. And of course, it has to be science or evidence-based. It has to be based on reliable information. Here's some more. There has to be an integrated and balanced or holistic approach to adaptation. There has to be priority set. There have to be targets set in terms of the scale of the adaptation, in terms of the sectors and communities that are targeted. It has to be transparent. There has to be communication among stakeholders and producers, and there has to be accountability. And finally, there has to be monitoring, and decisions have to be reviewed in retrospect. And once again, this is part of the accountability of adaptation to climate change. So given that, that view, that conceptual view of planned adaptation to climate change, I want to compare this to the key principles of sustainable agriculture. And there's various sources of this information. I'm using the ALIS project, which at their website has a list of the key principles. And I want you to note the correlation or the comparability between these principles and the ones I just mentioned. There's a direct correlation in terms of accountability, evidence-based, engaging the community, targeted, integrated, and so on. So you can argue that any kind of strategy, farming practice that is sustainable at the same time is increasing resilience to climate change. It represents a suitable adaptation to climate change. And it can also argue that taking advantage of the agro-ecosystem is a good approach. The use of the local biodiversity and ecosystem services, whether it's wetlands, whether it's a native pasture, taking advantage of the local ecosystem is considered to be good practice in terms of ecosystem-based adaptation. That the local agricultural community can develop more sustainable and resilient systems if it takes advantage of the local ecological goods and services. Well, I want to provide that context because there's a lot of talk these days about regenerative agriculture. And this is a book that came out a few years ago. And this fellow, this crop producer from North Dakota, just over the border from Saskatchewan, is sort of seen as the champion of regenerative agriculture. And a lot of people swear by this approach. Now, regenerative agriculture, producers tell me, it represents really a whole array of farming practices, including no-till, min-till, cover crops, maintaining biodiversity, maintaining wetlands, rotational grazing. And so any or all of those practices represents regenerative agriculture because it's maintaining the soil integrity and biodiversity. And after all, of course, soil and soil nutrients and soil moisture is the basis for agriculture. I just saw an interview with Gabe Brown the other day, and he was saying that the drought of this summer has devastated crop production in North Dakota, including their operation, although they're doing quite a bit better than most of their neighbors because they have been practicing regenerative agriculture for the past several decades. And you'll see this everywhere. You know, there are webinars and there's all kinds of articles in magazines and newspapers about regenerative agriculture. And then I want to refer briefly to the BRACE program because the BRACE program is funding the ART initiative. So these training sessions that you're attending are funded by the federal BRACE program, which is building regional adaptation capacity and expertise to climate change. So right now you are participating in a BRACE project. I want to mention there are 2 BRACE projects in Saskatchewan, both focused on agriculture. They are led by the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency, and PARC is involved in terms of providing scientific information. So one of them is the Agricultural Water Management Project. It's a program where, where producers and qualified persons, agronomists and engineers who work with producers, are being trained about the best practices for draining agricultural land. There is a set of drainage regulations in Saskatchewan which really have not been implemented, but are being implemented now. And so there is this training program ongoing, and there is a climate change component because, like Elaine said, one of the most reliable projections of future climate is we expect more precipitation. But we expect that precipitation to fall in the form of more intense rainstorms. And so this delivery of heavy rain and local flooding has to be considered when drainage systems are built on agricultural land on the prairies. And then, of course, excess water. The other side of the coin is drought. And so the other BRACE project in Saskatchewan is building capacity for community hydrologic drought response. And PARC is providing the Water Security Agency with a history of drought on the prairies. For the past 120 years, we're using a lot of the information developed by the Saskatchewan Research Council, including Elaine Wheaton and her colleagues. But at PARC, we have information on drought that goes back to the year 888, because we have a trimming lab and we look at the growth of trees on the prairies, and on the margins of the prairies, tree growth requires soil moisture. And so we've been able to reconstruct wet years in blue and dry years in red back to the year 888. And if you look at the red bars, I think the note is that every century has had one very long drought. In the 20th century, it was the 1930s. But if you go back even further, the droughts were longer and more severe than before the prairies were settled for agriculture. And so the worst case scenario for the future is when, not if, but when one of these decade-long droughts reoccurs, but in a climate that is much warmer than in the past. Well, the ultimate adaptation to a dry climate is irrigation. Throughout the world, in the driest climates, agriculture is only possible through irrigation. And most of the irrigation in Canada is in southern Alberta, and to a lesser extent, southwestern Saskatchewan. So a couple of years ago, the Saskatchewan government announced that they were going to spend $4 billion on expanding agriculture in southwestern Saskatchewan by utilizing the water in Lake Diefenbaker, which of course comes from Alberta. And I should also mention that Alberta also plans to invest in expanded agriculture. So this is a fundamental adaptation to a dry climate, which is preparing the prairies for even more severe and prolonged drought. However, there's one serious limitation. It assumes that water is available. So there will be years in which irrigation isn't possible because the reservoirs don't have sufficient water. And we know that there are historical precedents for this. 2001, there was not enough water in southern Alberta to support irrigation, plus all the other uses, which is the reason that Alberta Environment and Parks introduced closed some of the southern tributaries to further water allocation. And so we expect there will be years in the future where, despite the expanded irrigation, it won't be possible. And then finally, I want to say a few words about this project because very recently, PARC was collaborated with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry on a project to examine shifting agricultural crop suitability in a changing climate. We looked throughout Alberta to see where the opportunities would lie for expanding crop production into areas which have historically not supported canola, wheat, barley, forage crops, and pulses, and so on. So the objective was to take a range of future climate change scenarios and apply them to this Agriculture Crop Adaptation Atlas and database that's built and maintained by AAF. First of all, a little bit about the AgCAD model and the two basic factors, climate and soils. And for each of those factors, there are a series of components: heat, moisture, physical, chemical, soil conditions, and drainage, and a number of measurable parameters, including under climate, a series of agroclimatic variables, the same ones that Elaine discussed. And so the role of PARC was to provide AAF with data for these agroclimatic parameters, in particular data for the future. But first of all, I have to note that there are some fairly major assumptions and limitations done with this kind of work. We're only talking about the potential of the soil and climate to produce crops. It doesn't consider soil and water management or adaptation, or all the various social and economic factors that determine where crops are produced. It's not, I mean, land can be suitable for producing a certain crop, but farmers in that region choose for various reasons not to seed that crop. Also, we only looked at shifts in average conditions between the past and the future. Crop yield, of course, depends very much on short-term climate variability and extreme weather, as Elaine mentioned. That hasn't been built in, it could be. We compared crop suitability, model crop suitability to recorded crop yields, but these are on a different spatial framework, townships versus municipalities. And we didn't consider irrigation, it's only red-fed agriculture. So please consider these assumptions and limitations, because when you interpret the results we got, and first of all, we had to verify that the results being produced by the model were somewhat reasonable. So on the left is the output for the model for, this is barley. So the yellow area is what's considered moderately suitable land for barley production, whereas the green area is where the land which is very suitable for barley production. On the right is the actual crop yields. And you can see that there's a, if you look just visually, there's a reasonable match between what the model is saying about suitability for producing barley and where it's actually produced. Well, of course, I'm showing you the best results. If we were to look at wheat, canola, and so on, it's not nearly as good. And then looking into the future, what we gave AAF is climate projections from regional climate models for each one of those dots. I'm also showing you one cell from a global climate model, just to indicate the resolution of the data that we gave them. So we are giving them climate projections from many, many more locations than just a single cell from a global climate model. The data have been dynamically downscaled to all of those points, thousands of points in Alberta. And so here is what's called a scatter plot of the change in precipitation on the vertical axis and the change in minimum temperature on the horizontal axis for the growing season, comparing 30 years in the past up to 2019 to 30 years in the future beginning in 2051. And we gave them results from 11 regional climate models, and we've highlighted 4 models that sort of capture the complete range of the change in precipitation and minimum temperature. So the scientists at AAF took this information, ran their model, and we produced 72 maps for 6 crops, 4 different climate projections, 3 different time periods. And I'm showing you 3 of those 72 maps. This is for canola, with the historical conditions in the first left-hand map, and then 2 future 30-year periods. And if you squint, you'll see more green going forward. In other words, more of the land in Alberta is suitable for the production of canola in a changing climate. But given the assumptions and limitations, I wouldn't pick a township from this map and say, hey, look, let's go buy land because it's going to be more suitable for producing canola. We're just looking at the patterns here. And so the conclusions are, given this simulation of the future climate, that the number of townships with suitable growing conditions goes up. With a few exceptions, there was already a question today about temperature threshold. And in fact, in this simulation, the production of peas and wheat initially goes up, but then decreases. And we think that's because a climate threshold has been exceeded where there's actually too much heat and it has a detrimental effect on the yield of peas and wheat. With the exception of those two crops, climate change favors annual crop production until the end of the century throughout Alberta. And a couple more conclusions. This information could assist the ag sector in Alberta with decision-making related to crop selection, diversification, and the best use of available land and water. I say could because I think we need to improve on this research, and we can also extend it from Alberta across the prairie provinces.
I'm going to present, as the title suggests, on the economics or economic aspects of climate change with an on-farm perspective. And so to transition from Elaine and Dave and Melanie, is the science is certainly undeniable, but as the research in the science area goes, it tends to look at very large geographical areas, and it needs to generalize in terms of how many, like Dave said, how many observations can be collected in space. But when it comes to adaptation and adoption behavior to the risks of climate change, these are decisions that individual farm operators, farmers and ranchers have to make on a very individualistic and small scale basis. And so while you mainly think of, or you may think of economics being about markets and studying prices and looking at trade, and obviously there's policy involved, economics is also and foremost the study of the behavior of individuals in a market context. So hence, I'll title this The Economics of Climate Change in Agriculture. And I hope by the end of me talking, you will get my ... but don't call it climate change, because it still is, surprisingly, a topic that's sort of sensitive and often highly politicized when we speak about it. So here's my take on it. It's undeniable that climate change is a huge challenge, particularly because agriculture is so exposed to the natural elements, much more than many and most other sectors that make up the economy. And it's also particularly important to understand how climate change affects agriculture and how climate change reacts, because it's truly a global issue. I think that's undeniable. But we are expecting small, relatively, in relation to many other sectors, relative small and family farms to do something about it. So we are not asking General Motors, the Ford Corporation, or Intel or Google to adapt and adopt climate change measures. We're asking very small, very particular businesses in the agriculture industry to do that. And so one of the main arguments that economists use to think about what these challenges may entail is that we are asking private small farms to invest time, money, and effort at a large scale to actually do something that we all benefit from. And that's one of the major friction points that economists see in this debate about adaptation and adoption, that it is a mismatch between what we want farmers to do and to adapt to, and they're going to benefit from adaptation. That has been clearly made, the points by Elaine and Dave. But we also want them to do it for us, because we want adaptation to climate change so that our food security and our food supply remain stable. So are we sending the right messages to individual producers? The question I like to ask, and I have been asking with colleagues over the last few years and several projects here in Alberta and Saskatchewan, is how can we incentivize the individual producer to actually adapt to climate change? We're not talking about adaptation per se a lot. We mainly speak about adoption or adopting mitigative behaviors, with the idea that adoption will benefit the producer, but will also produce these emissions benefits or emission outcome reductions that societies, that Canadians expect agriculture producers to sort of deliver on. The key question that economists ask in this context, who should actually pay for that? Should we make farmers pay because it's their adaptation? They want to survive. They want to guarantee production in 20 years. Or should I, as a taxpayer, pay for that because I want agriculture to survive and I need it to do well and thrive in terms of productivity moving forward because I want to have something to eat? And I think the jury is still out. So when it comes to what we know about that challenge, we know a lot about the science, and we've heard beautiful results that some of which I had not heard before in terms of agronomic adaptation and the science behind it, and possible adaptation strategies of how production needs to adjust. We also have mechanisms in place such as insurance, both government incentivized and private, that are basically, and I'm putting that in quotes because it's my take on what insurance does, is that allows us to protect the status quo of current agricultural practices with insurance mechanisms, allowing them to cover losses after droughts or extreme rainfalls, hailstorms, and the like. And then we have this very complicated and complex Alberta emissions offset system. So we're using policy tools and market tools to allow farmers to sell carbon offsets or carbon credits. But this is new, untested, and it's not quite sure what this will do in terms of farmers, producers' adaptation and adoption strategies. What we don't know is still very much in this day and age is what producers really think about climate change adaptation, what their willingness to adopt is, and how much they're really interested in protecting themselves and everybody else in that process. So we don't really know what they want. And that's certainly most important to understand. How can we make sure that what they want is in line with what they should be doing and what society wants? So here's a way of thinking about this, I guess, with an economic mindset. What makes climate change so special is that it comes with this large degree of variability and with that uncertainty. Wet years, drought years, temperatures going up, but that doesn't mean that each year is going to be warmer and each winter is going to be warmer or colder. So it's hidden, uncertain, and that presents a challenge to the planning of on-farm production processes that are caused by climate change and its related weather patterns. So the three things that's three ways in which these risk factors present themselves to the individual operator, farm operator. So we have on-farm production risks that come with the weather. Those can be pretty well managed with existing technologies in a certain constraints on farm. That's why I said farmers can manage them, they can control them to a certain extent. If we expand the geographic area to Western Canada, or the world at large, these climate change outcomes will, and we understand this very well if we listen to the news, are having market price and input cost effects. Whether they're COVID related these days or not, there's going to be bottlenecks, there's going to be fluctuations in commodity prices that Canadian farmers and Alberta and Saskatchewan farmers are largely exposed to. They can engage in contracting, they can hedge their production. So there's tools to mitigate some of that risk. And then, of course, on the larger international scale, supply chain and trade related disruptions, whether they are tariff policies or whether they are related to India not accepting certain pulses because they have been treated in Canada a certain way. So many of these non-tariff measures, if you have heard about those, the individual farmer can literally do nothing on this front, and therefore hope is the only management form. So the way I thought about this when I prepared for this talk, based on some work that we have done, is if we think about a profit function, and I think this aspect gets lost in this discussion once in a while, is that climate change adaptation does not purely take place in the economic realm. Farms are businesses, they're family businesses, and sometimes they're more than family businesses. So having income, producing a profitable or maintaining a profitable farm operation is paramount. So when we think about the climate risk, how they affect this ultimate goal and behavior of the individual producer is that they affect prices and quantities, but they also affect the prices of inputs, W, and the quantity of inputs that may be available or that could be or should be used. So for prices, we see and we have experienced increasing volatility in commodity prices and related future markets. If you just look the last few years, what COVID has done and what climate events such as this year and previous years have done to commodity prices and how future markets track commodity prices. With the price volatility that is based on volatility and harvest expectations, might they be very good, the market gets flushed, prices tank, or there has been there's expectations that wheat harvests in 2021 across the world will be much lower than we had anticipated only a year and so ago. And that will have implications again also on the availability of commodities and their trade patterns. As COVID has shown us, bottlenecks in supply chain have also not impacts on the output of commodity crops, but especially also on access to inputs such as fertilizers, pesticide, and other things that have to be shipped and distributed in areas. And so therefore climate change and its related risk factors have effects on each individual variable in the farmer's ultimately profit or income calculation. And I think we should not forget how important this is to the overall ability of a farm operation to adapt, because adaptation through adoption of technologies or practices costs time and money. And if the fundamentals of profitable farm operations are not there, individual farmers will find it very hard to adapt in any meaningful way. So here are a few just off the top, very easy or very general, I want to say, ways to think about how to mitigate these climate change induced risks on the farm's profit function. So on the revenue side, for a long time, we have been talking to farmers and with farmers about the benefits of hedging and forward contracting. And so while these mechanisms are widespread, especially with larger farm operations in Western Canada, and the young students that graduate from our agriculture faculty are well trained to understand and use these systems, we have learned that overusing them or using them intensively came at quite a high risk recently when farmers that had contracted certain crops in forward contracts that were affected by the drought conditions this year were unable to fulfill their contracts. And these contracts will specify penalties that farmers will have to pay, or they will have to provide the promised commodity in the same quantity and quality by buying it somewhere else in the market and then not providing it to their clients. So these can be quite detrimental outcomes that climate change can have even on the management of the sales and the revenue side of a crop or even livestock operation. So the solution here would be to maybe really follow the advice that Elaine and Dave have been providing and engage in the processes that Melanie has been talking about to try to design a crop rotation system on farm and appropriate technologies that actually make the farm more resilient to the variation in both output, but also maybe more resilient and less dependent, maybe through regenerative agriculture, on the input side of the production. So the question is, can Western Canadian farms actually maintain or become more productive in a more extensive and sustainable way, and therefore not be so dependent on major input markets or major middle fertilizer and other kinds of inputs that at some times and moving into the future may be very much more difficult to come by and more expensive to use. So this would lead to sort of a recommendation or bottom line that a lot of farmers will need to reevaluate their production system on a more holistic basis when it comes to soil fertility, whether it's their tillage practices, and what their production system looks like now and what it should maybe look like if they make climate change, concerning adaptations moving forward. Okay. What the big problem in this thinking and in the adaptation and adoption decisions that farmers make is the fact that the climate risks that we have seen on the maps we've shown this morning are very variable, and there's always these little pockets where farmers report bumper crops and super years, although many others are not having such a good time. So that uncertainty and that high variability sends mixed messages when it comes to scientists and others wanting to communicate, and you are communicating with producers about measures they should be taking. And so if I was a producer and I'm getting these mixed messages, I may have had positive input from a colleague down the road, yet an extension specialist is wanting to talk to me into resiliency measures or regenerative agriculture measures to protect my farm. I may sometimes not really feel that it is my task or that I really need to make these decisions to protect myself or do something for society by making Canadian agriculture more resilient. And this brings me to the second part of my presentation. We have done, I want to show you an example of a study that we have done in 2018, 2019, that specifically tried to address this issue of are Western Canadian and Alberta farmers in particular, are Alberta farmers motivated to do something about climate change by adopting practices or by engaging in adaptation that involves adopting practices that have been scientifically proven to have this climate mitigative or climate resilient protective element to them. And as you will see, what I'm telling you and what I'm showing is that surprised us as well, and maybe it doesn't surprise all of you, is that climate change in agriculture and the need for adaptation seems to, in 2018, 2019, and I would say in 2021, seems to be still a fairly tough sell. So the study was called, when it was published, Don't Call It Climate Change, because we found out that farmers are still climate skeptic. They don't see the connection between the evidence of this global scale of this phenomenon and how it impacts them individually. So we want farmers to take climate change serious, but as business owners, getting them to take a proactive approach in this climate change decision-making doesn't seem to be straightforward. So the research question we ask is, what is the role of the farmer in on-farm climate change? Replace mitigation maybe with adaptation and adoption. So here's the study, Don't Call It Climate Change, Climate Skeptic Farmers' Adoption of Climate Mitigative Practices, sort of was the title of this published study. And I'm just going to present you with some snippets of results, and then I want to conclude with some outcome. When we ask farmers if climate change is occurring, the vast majority on the left-hand side you see said, yes, climate change is there, heard about it, not a problem. But when we ask them what is causing climate change, you see a much more divisive or diverse picture. And the majority seems to be not so convinced that it is truly human caused. So with that in mind, it may already be difficult to get farmers to fully buy into adaptation strategies if they're not sure that we as humans are even, or they as farmers are not even the ones that need to do something about it. When we then ask, how concerned are you about a range of factors in the future of Canadian agriculture, we also got the impression that it is not necessarily climate change and its related impacts on production that is at top of mind of producers. So this data is about 3 years old by now, but it's the latest reliable observation that we can make without any COVID interference that would make our results a little fuzzy. Farmers are stewards of the land, so they are keenly aware of that environmental quality of the land is important, and you see that reflected in the answers. And they're also concerned with structural change in agriculture, which is a problem, but not necessarily in the climate change context. But what really has farmers most extremely or very concerned is their trade environment, is the prices and quantities of the products that they can sell into international markets. And only, not a majority of farmers, but some farmers are certainly somewhat concerned about climate change. So you see there's a range of individual opinions and perspectives on how serious this problem really is. When we ask them to rank certain environmental issues on farm in terms of how important it is to their operation, again, reducing and sequestering greenhouse gas emissions as a climate mitigative measure, not necessarily an adaptive measure, but a measure that contributes to that, it ranked at the bottom of what was considered to be environmentally important. Of course, soil and water are the key productive elements in crop agriculture and livestock agriculture, so they came first. Air quality comes down, biodiversity was much, much higher than the concern about greenhouse gas emissions, which is the societal focus when we talk about adoption, adaptation, and mitigation and the role agriculture plays. When we then went on and wanted to explore why farmers were not doing or were not wanting to do certain things on farm that are related to environmental projects, phrasing the issue a little bit more broadly, we learned that the biggest reason was financial. If financial barriers, which also include sort of time and effort spent on environmental practices, are the biggest barriers to individual farmers tackling climate-related adaptation and adoption strategies. Skepticism in terms of I need to try it out before I'm going to really implement something. So again, this element of uncertainty, I'm not really sure this is something I should be doing because I'm having the profitability and the productivity of my operation in mind, or it's too time consuming, and time, is equal money. So one of these, the first three most important reasons are all related to the potential financial or monetary impacts of adopting environmental measures in the operation. And again, climate change is not on this list. So we then ask, okay, so what are farmers actually doing in terms of adoption or adaptation strategies? And on the next slide, I will show you a very large table that has a list of 21 scientifically proven climate change beneficial or protective on-farm management practices. We call them BMPs, or best management practices. And we've took these practices out of highly cited international literature and looked for relevant practices for Western Canadian agriculture with a focus on Alberta. And we have three columns, so the practices, and then producers already adopted these practices. They told us in a survey. They would consider adoption of these practices in the near future, or they basically told us, that's not going to happen on my operation, go away. So now comes the big file. These adoption numbers here are, you see, out of the total number of farmers that answer these questions. So we have feedback from about 300 farmers, and you see not all the farmers answered all these questions because practices were not relevant, or they just didn't want to share this information with us. So I have two blobs, one yellow one at the top and one yellow one at the bottom. The top one are practices that the majority of Alberta farmers have already adopted that have some connection to climate change. Leave crop residue on fields. Dave has shown us a beautiful picture of what that looks like. Zero tillage. Eileen has been speaking about zero tillage, making it in Western Canada because of its proven benefits. Using precision agriculture, we have heard about that this technology shift has allowed adaptation to all sorts of different risk factors that are thrown at producers. And then the installation of LED lights, which is probably a bit of an outlier. You may raise your eyebrows as much as I do. That's something that a lot of people have been doing because it saves on electricity bills. That's what farmers have reported and been doing. When we go to the bottom, we see things that are known to be beneficial in terms of adaptation or adoption, but they're also much more costly. Restoration of wetlands, installing solar panels, production of bioenergy using manure and crop residues, or building a covered manure storage facility to mitigate nitrous oxides and methane emissions and so on. These can be multi-million-dollar projects in form, and hence it is surprising that about a third of the farmers or a quarter of the farmers that responded to this question actually indicated a willingness to do it. But we also see that the unwillingness to adopt, or the no adoption on the third column, actually the numbers increase as the types of practices become more cumbersome, more expensive, and also more risky for the individual producer to take on. So a clear picture that easy and proven technologies have been adopted by larger numbers, more expensive, more risky, more uncertain adoption strategies or BMPs are considered maybe as a future option, but also large numbers of farmers will not consider these. At least they are open about that strategy. So when we look at and this is my last slide, we also wanted to explore, we have had discussions about these slides amongst the presenters and the organizers. We also wanted to learn what kind of programs or policy approaches would farmers actually appreciate that would help them in their climate change related mitigation and adoption strategies. And so here is a probably politically kind of charged slide, but I wanted to show you this slide because it shows clearly that in order to incentivize, so coming back to my initial question, in order to incentivize climate change adaptation and adoption of various things, if I can direct your attention to the bottom of these horizontal bars, farmers look at financial and in-kind support to help them offset the on-farm cost of adoption and adaptation strategies. So if we want to incentivize farmers to get on board with climate change adaptation, we have to help them offset the financial costs of doing so, because they're doing us as consumers and as Canadians, as society, a large favor, beyond just looking after the sort of the resilience of their individual operation. So take-home messages: climate change is complex and has many hidden and uncertain risk factors that are difficult for farmers to completely wrap their head around. The costs of adaptation and adoption are well understood, but when it comes to the benefits to the individual producers, it's maybe a bit more difficult. We need to remember that a lot of the benefits of adaptation and adoption strategies are ultimately ending up with us as Canadians, as consumers and as citizens. And so working with producers on climate change adaptation requires that understanding that they're facing these very specific barriers, and also facilitators, and only direct support that can help offset the cost of this transition process will ultimately get more farmers to engage in adaptation.
And we just, because that was a lot of information from Dave, Sven, and myself, we just thought we'd package it all up at the very end, some key messages, and then we'll move into the question, answer, and polling. So what we saw there, I think I captured that adaptation success is going to pertain to collaboration. Partnerships are essential. That includes at the farm level and with associations, with researchers and government. Programs and tools that are developed, they need to be evidence-based. As Dave identified, there's need for more and improved research. And as Sven pointed out, farmers need to see that it's proven practices, something that is evidence-based and it's going to work. It's got to be a sustainable approach. You've got to look at it holistically and consider the economic and social aspects for it to be sustainable. It's got to be prioritized at relevant scales and sectors for it to be sustainable. And there's got to be funding. The funding is sometimes available at research, training, and capacity building. And as Sven identified, incentivization is going to be some in-kind support to offset those costs to the farmers.
So we're trying to get an idea of what adaptation measures you've applied in your work.
So you've got a lot of amazing information crammed in a short time, which is awesome for our efficiency of learning. I'm going to ask you to step back from all that technical information. Now you have that as your base, and many of you work in this topic every day, to say, okay, now how do we have a conversation with people who would never sign up to be part of a climate change or adaptation resilience training session, the rest of the population that aren't with us today. Oh, and I will tell you, my company name is called Loft because we created, my colleague Maggie is a chicken farmer and a former ag journalist. We created Loft 32 with the vision to help elevate the conversations on food and farming by elevating people, which is exactly what we're doing today, which is very exciting for me. And 32, I have 32 very good business-like reasons, but realistically, it's my hockey number. So that's the reason for 32, which is a very Canadian reason for naming your company. So we've been very focused on farming, production practices, technical topics related to climate change and adaptation resiliency. I want you to recognize that most people don't live in that space, your beautiful space in Alberta, which I love your province dearly, but people do eat every day. And so these conversations definitely go right through to the table. And as a matter of fact, they don't go farm to table the way we think of it. They really go table back to farm. So I want you to shift gears for a minute and get out of your technical worlds and think a little bit more about where these conversations really happen with real people, your neighbors, your family, your friends, your colleagues, your clients. So a few things that I find when I'm talking with my people in agriculture and technical designations, of which many of you are of that ilk, is that it's frustrating that we can't just share our facts. We have so much subject matter expertise. You just heard a bunch this morning who knows so much about these topics, and it's just not resonating. And so this little thing called post-truth, truthiness, the reality of facts are less influential in shaping public opinion is very, very frustrating. Now, I will say I have seen a shift. So that was 2017. In the last couple of years with the terminology fake news from south of the border, I have seen a shift to more critical thinking to say, you know what, cut the BS. What do I really need to know? Who's a credible expert? I have seen a glimmer of hope on critical thinking when it comes to environmental topics. So similar to the data that Sven shared, from a consumer perspective instead of the farmer perspective, what's important to Canadians? And this is just really important. Remember that lady looking in the fridge to say what's really on people's mind and what's important to people. So the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, which is the group that I used to lead and modeled after the US Centre for Food Integrity, which is really interesting, so we can get some North American data. When we ask people what's really important to them, and this data has been collected since 2016, the top two issues are always rising cost of food and keeping healthy food affordable. Ahead of healthcare, economy, energy costs. Energy costs just snuck back up in the top 5 in 2020. It was down in 6 or 7 for a few years. So very similar to the farmer data, with affordability being at the top of the list. So consumers we're very egocentric, sorry to report, but we're very concerned about how things affect us and our lives, which starts with the price of food. Other food system concerns and where they fit, including what we're talking about today. Climate change is right in the middle of the pack, I would say. And then it goes down to the bottom, which always makes me a little bit sad, but we are not concerned about feeding other countries. And feeding a hungry world has been a very common rally cry in the agriculture sector for a long time, because it's valid and important. And if we can feed more people on less land, it's always one of our goals in agriculture, including feeding people in other countries. It does not resonate with the public. They want their own healthy, affordable food, and the results are the same in the rest of in North America. And the having enough food to feed Canada, I thought that might be a little bit higher post-COVID, that we'll see what the 2021 data looks like. So the reality here is very similar to what we saw in the farmer data. Costs are at the top. The topics around climate change is lower. Now, another study that the Center for Food Integrity did mapped out the number of conversations people were having around food. So instead of a survey, a traditional quantitative style survey where we asked, how important is this issue to you? You can make everything important, by the way, it wasn't a forced ranking, where climate change kind of came out in the middle of the road. When we mapped out what conversations Canadians were having, just to give you an example, free trade was at the top of agricultural topics, and then climate change was second. So just because it's not a big concern doesn't mean people aren't having conversations about it. And then, as Sven pointed out, don't call it climate change. Farmers were not in those conversations, and people in agriculture, we are having separate conversations about sustainability. So, and best management practices, nutrient management, et cetera, et cetera. So the consumers, although they're not as concerned as we might think they would be about climate change, they are talking about it. So that's why we're here, is to say, okay, we've got all of you, some of you are really huge subject matter experts on the topic. Other of you, like me, are always learning more, but we're in the situation where we should be having conversations about adaptation and just talking to people when they just, even people in conversation after today, you know, what were you up to today? Oh, I was part of this workshop. How do you describe what we're talking about, especially when they have the infamous follow-up question? So I'm going to give you a few tips for communicating in general about issues and sometimes difficult topics. But of course, we're going to be putting the climate change and adaptation resiliency filter on it today. So in general, people fit along this spectrum from, you know, extreme right and extreme left. And then in Canada, we're very comfortable in the middle or somewhere in the gray areas. We're less comfortable with extreme positions on the spectrum. So whenever you're having a conversation with someone, you should be self-aware about where you fit on the spectrum and then where they might fit on the spectrum on the specific topic. And this has become really evident that people that you might normally be aligned with on the point of view spectrum, you're seeing quite extreme differences of opinion around the topic of vaccination, if we put that on here. And so you don't live in a certain area of the spectrum. You can't be all left all the time. Well, you could be, you could choose to be wherever you want, but it's unlikely that you're going to be in one area. So on any given topic, people will move around. So as soon as you go to have a conversation with a client, a coworker, a friend, about a topic, you need to, the best place to start is where to try to figure out where they might be on the point of view spectrum and to be self-aware about where you are on the spectrum. And when we're going to talk about you know, climate change deniers or people that don't even think this is a worthwhile topic, I want you to ask yourself the question, which a farmer from the US often has asked in her presentations, which is, when's the last time you changed your mind? So, and I say that lovingly to say, you know, changing someone's point of view is not necessarily an easy thing. Specifically, the further entrenched they are on one side or the other. So once it becomes a firm belief, it's almost impossible to shift somebody, but you can maybe edge them across. So, but I feel you saw the data on Canadians, you saw the data on farmers. I think there's a lot of people that are in the middle, even if they're one way a little bit or the other, that are absolutely open to having these conversations. And that's our goal. So I view this as a conversation, not a lecture. Well, I'm giving you a lecture today, but your goal is to have a conversation with people. And I have to say, myself included, we haven't been very successful about this in the past. We just try to give people more facts. So it's like, oh, you don't agree with our way of thinking? Well, here's a study. Oh, you don't agree with what we're trying to say? Here's some more research, or, you know, here's a fact sheet. You know, we've been giving people more and more and more facts. But if you think about something, if you're not sure about something or you're slightly hesitant about it, giving them, you know, a stack of scientific papers or data like we saw some today is probably not going to change their mind. So I want you to think a little bit about the power of storytelling, because we are hardwired to learn by storytelling. And it started, you know, way back in the caveman days, you know, with the drawings on the caves, that people shared lessons by storytelling. And it became really important that that's how people learn and they remember and they relate to things. So even, you know, today, if we think about some of our subject matter experts we heard from today, you need to relate to them as a human being before you'll give them permission to share their facts with you. So I view it as a big old conversation at a barbecue. And if you're the new neighbor that comes to the community barbecue and you sit down to have a chat with somebody or a group of people and they ask what you do for a living, how do you position yourself with those people to be an effective storyteller, that they'll be like, oh, Crystal seems really honest and somebody I could trust, and she works in agriculture, so, you know, maybe I should ask her about topic XYZ, and she's going to be someone that I'm going to respect what she has to say, that I feel it's somebody I can trust. So harnessing the power of storytelling to relate to people is it's a really powerful technique. So the base of being successful with these conversations all lies around shared values. And that's a whole other, this is a whole talk unto itself, but I'll cover it in short form to say there is peer-reviewed and published research. It started in the US and we repeated it here in Canada when I was the first thing the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity did. is that when it comes to earning public trust in food and farming, shared values are 3 to 5 times more impactful than facts. So this is just backing up what I had to say about why we haven't been successful in some of the conversations around food and farming in the past to get more public support for things, or client support, because whether you're dealing with a farmer, an agricultural engineer, or your next door neighbor, we're all human beings first outside of our titles. So this is, as I said, these are core communications tools, and they all start with shared values. So if you think about a really difficult news story like mad cow disease, BSC, when it hit the news, if you can think back, it's a long time ago now, but if you think back about some of the spokespeople and how we were trying to manage it, and I was, early in my career, part of it behind the scenes, and I'm like, we're not competing where we need to be, in that, say you had a mom in the UK, where the stories were really inflamed. And so you have a mom in the UK, like, is this beef going to kill my baby? And then we would send out an E. coli scientist to try to address it with their research. Most studies show that, of course, there's no such thing as zero risk. And, all the logic that Dr. Spock, Spock on Star Trek would absolutely relate to, but it wasn't dealing with the actual emotional problems that people were having with the topic, and the fear, quite frankly, it's the fear. So how to connect with people is through shared values. And when it comes to climate change, it's this value around protecting our planet, our land, our water, our air, our resources for future generations. And then, of course, things like family would come into play here as well. So those are the basics. And then now we're going to take it up a notch, because talking about climate change and some of the related topics is not the easiest topic. So I put my tough topic toilet paper on there on why is the topic difficult for some people? And if you start by thinking about why it's a difficult topic to have a conversation with, or frustrating for some reason, it's probably about the people. It's probably about you, and it's also about them. So I'll give you a few tips and ideas on how to make it less difficult rather. So starting with, why is it a difficult topic? Well, remember I said the emotion around BSE, if we use that sad example, there's a lot of emotion, and people in expertise roles are not necessarily used to dealing with emotion. We're used to dealing with facts, and subject matter experts specifically, and people in agriculture, we're very pragmatic. So it's like, what do I need to know? You're a respected expert, I'm going to listen. So these conversations are frustrating for us, because it's like, well, here's the data. Like, why are you not adopting this? And here's the data. Why aren't you shifting to this? It just seems so logical that that's what you should do. But there's that map, and maybe you've seen the meme of, your plan, which is point A to point B, which is a little straight line, and then reality, and it's a little person on a bike going up hills and, all this little crazy thing. That's really the way we make decisions, even though we like to think it's a logical point A to point B. Some things are difficult because it's morally or ethically challenging. So somebody that's, I don't care what the science says, I just think that's wrong. Wow, what do you say to that? And then sometimes things surprise you. So if you were at that community barbecue and somebody asked you a difficult question that you weren't prepared for. And I had this, I play hockey, and I was invited into the dressing room, a neighboring dressing room of another team. They're like, come on in, we're having a few drinks. So this is, pre-COVID, obviously. And so I come in, and the first thing somebody asks me about laying hens, and a very difficult question. And I was like, it's like a Friday night, I'm like, you're always on duty. So a difficult topic could come at you anytime it surprises you. Now, I mentioned laying hens. Some of you might be going, whoa, I don't know anything about laying hens. So it could be outside your expertise. So that often takes us aback. And then, of course, we're always, many of you work in government roles or for organizations, so there's brand reputation, etc., that you need to take some of these questions very seriously. It's not always just a barbecue. It could be a media person asking you a difficult question. So my first tip for you outside of the advice on positioning with shared values would be for you personally to think about a few topics that you aren't really comfortable. And I always, when I do media training or spokesperson training, I always get them to share the question they hope they're never asked. So you don't need to share it with me, but you can type in the comments if you want to share what you feel nervous about, even just a topic. What do you dread being asked about? And I find once you name it, it becomes a little less uncomfortable. And then spend some time thinking about how you might answer it, which we're gonna practice a couple together. But and again, as I said, this isn't just around this topic, but it definitely suits it really well. So my first piece of advice around answering these tough questions will be begin with the end in mind, which is to start with the audience. It's really important that you understand. Remember, I showed you that spectrum to try to figure out where they're coming from, what are they concerned, and maybe why. So starting by asking them some questions will really help give you some time to think about it. And it will also help you connect with them better if you better understand their concern. Because what I find, particularly in agriculture topics and this topic, is people don't really know very much about it, but they've heard something, or they saw a meme about it, or a tweet, or they read a headline, or maybe a couple sentences, or they know something bad is happening, and they don't really have a lot of expertise necessarily, or the opposite, of course, they've read everything about it and they have really strong opinions. So you got to figure that out. And so the other interesting thing is there's research that shows human being behavior is if you listen to someone when you ask them a question, they will give you the courtesy of listening back. So if you start your conversation by help me understand what your concern is, or why do you feel that way, then when you share your information as an expert, they are more likely to listen to you, which is awesome. So what's your role in this? So you start by figuring out where they're coming from. Then what's your role? And as people that work in this space or in your roles with your organizations, your role could be many things, but some of the ones I think about outside the just sharing the facts on it, remember, because obviously the facts do matter. I'm not saying the facts don't matter. It's just a matter of how you positioning. When I'm having a conversation around a tough topic or this topic specifically, one of my goals is to encourage critical thinking, to be like, oh, so why do you feel that way? Is that a credible source? And you don't want to be too confrontational on this, but you definitely want to get people thinking critically about where they're getting their information. You want to put extreme examples into perspective. They may have heard something or watched something on a shockumentary, as I call them. So it's like, oh, maybe that's not how we do things here in Alberta, or, maybe that was an extreme example. Here's kind of what we do more on a daily basis here at home. And by that, you want to help shape a new narrative based on your experience. They may have they've never attended today's session, and they don't have opportunities to have conversations with people like Elaine or Dave or Melanie or Sven. So I actually had this opportunity to hear these profs who spent their whole career researching this topic, and here's what they shared with me. So you can use your experience to shape a new narrative for them, which is framed up as a conversation. In the past, our industry has been quite confrontational with people that have different views than the way you might think something should roll. And so this is meant to be a conversation, not a lecture. So 2 ways, with respect, just like you would if you were sitting across the table from someone. So I want you to think less soapbox and megaphone and more, hey, what do you think? And let me share this. And I'm not really sure, but I think we could find that out, or I'll find that out and get back to you on it. It's just this conversational, less confrontational approach. So a couple of tools I want to share with you today is to help you effectively correct misinformation. Because remember, I said they might have seen a shockumentary, they saw something on social media. I'm going to put a really high odds on if they have, that's their source of information, chances are it's inaccurate, old, extreme examples. It's not really what you think they should know about the topic. And again, sub in your issue here, but we'll use our climate change and adaptation resiliency topic today. So one topic that came up on both the consumer side, as you recall, and in Sven's presentation on the producer side, was around financial. And so if someone is on one end of the spectrum around adaptation, resiliency, and the need for climate change related improvements, it's often financial related. So, or at least that's the first line of defense. So using the techniques that we've been talking about to connect with them with shared values is you need to start by asking them some questions. So, okay, I get that. I feel strongly about this topic too. What about this? Have you considered that you could actually make some economic gains if you position it like this? And just start those conversations to acknowledge that the financial burdens are a reality right off the hop without making them feel defensive. Because the more you make somebody defend their position, the more entrenched in it they'll become. So the technique you can use is, there's two that they're similar, and they both use what we call the rule of threes, is that you can start with a map technique. So you can say, globally, this is happening. So if they saw some shockumentary or something on, Netflix, or they read something somewhere, you'd be like, oh, I'm not really an expert on what they do there, but here's what we do at home. So you can take them there. So what I like to do is often it's US examples that we get, sometimes Europe, but it'd be like, okay, I'm not really familiar with US, but here in Canada, this is what we do. And then in my farm in the Ottawa Valley, we've done this with our grasslands, or a farm I visited, or here in Alberta, our program is about this. So physically take them there in their mind, so they can picture it to be like, oh, I saw that thing on TV, but it might have been US or Europe. But then here's what we're doing in Alberta. And, I just heard a lecture from a prof in Saskatchewan this week, and she shared this. Like, that is so awesome. So you physically take them away from whatever it is they got their information and bring them home to Alberta and to a ranch you visited. Like, how awesome is that? Another technique that's really valuable is the time technique, because often people are not up to date on what we're doing in agriculture. They're very disconnected. Everybody knows that. So you can use the time technique. In the past, we did this. Today, we're working on this. And in the future, we hope to do this. And I put a note here. This is really effective for really tough topics because it helps us acknowledge where there are legitimate problems and or reasons. We're always in a continuous improvement mode in agriculture and food. So this technique lends itself to that, to say, hey, it's not always a sunny day with a butterfly. It's not all perfect. We recognize we need to do more. So in the future, we're investing in research and new technology, et cetera, et cetera. So an example would be, if someone's like, well, my grandfather used to run the homestead and the farm like this and the ranch like that. That was the good old days, and you'd be like, yeah, in the past, my grandfather did that too. Or, that's the way most farms in Canada were mixed farms and it looked like that. Today, it looks more like this. Farmers are getting more in touch with consumers. They're not just farming. They're more in touch with their end markets, things like, segregating crops, et cetera, to have different market designations, sustainable beef. They're doing things like that. And in the future, it could look more like this. So it helps you take them there, past, present, future. So your goal is, as I said, is to help shape a new narrative with your experience. So we will move to wrap things up with my attitude towards communications and the tools I gave you today, the map technique, the time technique, and then backing it up to the most important piece with connecting with shared values first, and then share your facts. If you just take one thing away from today, I really want you to remember that, and to very much view yourself as a work in progress. You're used to talking about technical topics at work and in your studies, if you're on the academic side, or your policies on the government side, you're always in the technical details. When you view yourself in this situation, and when it comes to conversation, you're also a continuous improvement model. So I love this quote. It's how I embrace communications, that you don't become an NHL hockey player after reading a fact sheet or one skate. You need some coaching and you need some practicing. So if you're interested in this kind of work and improving your communication skills, this is why we created Loft 32. We have some online online training on a website called utensil.ca. And for those of you that don't work in agriculture on a regular basis, or maybe you only work in one sector and you're looking to broaden your knowledge, utensil.ca does have a plain language guide to food and farming, which includes acronyms. My favorite one, by the way, is AI. Is it artificial intelligence, artificial insemination? You don't want to mix those up. It's awkward. So I encourage you to use our plain language guide. That's free. And then there's some online training on utensil.ca as well. And of course, we're here for coaching and training sessions and speakers, or just helping you have better conversations about food and farming. And with that, I'll wrap it up and say thank you for your time and attention and opportunity to be part of such an important forum today.